The oldest living member of the British royal family just humiliated Camilla in the most savage and public way ever. The Duke's wife is dead, his health is collapsing, and from that dark and broken place, he cancelled Camilla completely.
I'm delighted to have this opportunity to thank the people of Flanders, and especially Ypres and members of the Last Post Association, for continuing to honor the sacrifice of our fallen.
He made it crystal clear that the crown jewels would never, under any circumstances, find their way into her hands. Camilla fought furiously to overrule the decision. When nothing worked, she went straight to Charles and demanded he overrule it immediately. Charles looked her dead in the eye and said something so cold and so final that Camilla has not been the same since. The last man who remembered everything. The Duke of Kent looked straight at Camilla and turned his back on her. He saw her, he knew exactly who she was, and he walked away like she was dirt beneath his feet, like she was nothing, like she had never been anything. Every senior royal standing in that space watched it happen with their own eyes, and not one single person moved. This was the Cenotaph. November 2025, the National Service of Remembrance, one of the most solemn and sacred ceremonies in the entire British royal calendar. And the Duke of Kent, 90 years old, freshly shattered by the death of his wife, had just dismissed the Queen of England in front of the whole watching world. Sophie, Duchess of Edinburgh, had her arm locked underneath his just to keep him on his feet. He needed that. His body had been slowly giving out for months, and everyone present could see it written all over him. This appearance at this memorial on this morning may have been the last time he ever stood at this ceremony. The last time he ever stood anywhere like this at all, and he used it. He used every last thing he had left in him to say something that no crown, no title could ever take back. After he turned away from Camilla, he moved toward Catherine. He reached for her hand and he held it. He held it longer than the moment called for, longer than anyone standing nearby expected. And then he leaned in close to her ear and said something that only she could hear. The people standing nearest said the entire atmosphere in that space changed the moment the words left his mouth, like something that had been buried for a very long time had finally broken through the surface. What he said was pieced together afterward by people close to his household, and it was devastating. He told Catherine the jewels were going where they belonged. He told her that his mother's legacy was not going to end up around the neck of someone with no right to carry it. He never once said Camilla's name. He did not need to. Every person in that space already knew exactly who he meant and exactly what he had just done. Camilla knew before the day was over. Every detail of what happened had reached her within hours, and she did not take it quietly. She was furious in a way that the people around her said they had rarely seen. But before we get into what Camilla did next, you need to understand who this man actually is. Because without that, you cannot feel the full weight of what he just unleashed. The Duke of Kent has held his title for over 82 years. That makes him the longest-serving duke in British history. He and King Charles are the only two members of the royal family who hold the rank of Field Marshal in the British Army. He has watched kings take their last breath and queens be placed on their thrones. He has watched this institution survive wars, betrayals, and public humiliations that would have torn any ordinary family apart at the seams. And through all of it, he said nothing. He kept his head down. He kept his mouth shut. Until now. Now understand what he was carrying when he made that choice about who the jewelry would go to. His mother was Princess Marina of Greece and Denmark. She came from royal blood that ran directly into the Romanov dynasty, the Russian imperial family that was marched into a basement in Yekaterinburg in 1918 and shot dead. Every single jewel that Marina ever wore carried that history inside it. The Cambridge sapphire parure, the Kent pearl festoon tiara, the diamond girandole earrings, the pearl fringed tiara, the remodeled diamond bandeau that had once belonged to Queen Mary herself. These pieces survived a massacre. They survived 2 world wars. They survived a financial collapse so severe that the Duke and Duchess were forced to sell the most precious pieces privately, quietly, like people selling off the last things they had left. The sapphire tiara was sold. The stomacher was sold. Some of those pieces may have left Britain entirely and never come back. What remained was the broken remnant of what had once been one of the greatest private royal collections Britain had ever seen. And this 90-year-old man, standing at the cenotaph with Sophie holding him upright so he would not fall, was the last living person on Earth who remembered the hands that first held them. But there was something else he was carrying that morning. Something that had been eating at him for 30 years of silence. He had watched people destroyed by this institution. He had watched the palace grind good people into dust and then look away like nothing had happened. But of every story he had witnessed from the inside, one broke him more completely than anything else. The Duke of Kent had watched what this family did to Diana, and he had carried that wound every single day since, and her story had everything to do with the decision he made about those jewels. He knew. He was a first cousin to the Queen. He was a senior working royal through the 1980s and 1990s. He sat in rooms where conversations happened that the public was never allowed to hear. He knew about the betrayal. He knew about Charles and Camilla. And what he carried in silence for over 30 years was this. Diana was destroying herself from the inside out. She would take something sharp and draw it across her skin and watch herself bleed, and she would not cry. She said the pain she carried in her heart was so far beyond anything her skin could ever feel that the cutting almost felt like breathing again. She starved herself. She chained herself to her own suffering. Whether she was trying to hold herself together or punish herself for never being enough, the people who loved her were never fully sure. And perhaps she was not sure either. People close to her said she cut her own hair, stood in front of a mirror with scissors and cut it herself, and then stared at what she had done and said out loud that if Charles thought she was not beautiful enough, then fine, she would make herself ugly. She would finish the job he had already started on her soul. This was a woman being dismantled, piece by piece, inside a palace, while the people around her decided she was too much trouble to save. The Duke of Kent knew that Camilla was at the center of everything that was tearing Diana apart. And in the way men of his generation handled things that were too heavy to speak out loud, he said nothing and kept serving. But he did not forget, and he did not forgive. Not once, not ever. So when he stood at that cenotaph in November 2025 and turned his back on Camilla, he was delivering a verdict that had been sitting inside him for 30 years, waiting for the right moment to finally come out. But what built that moment runs far deeper than one cold morning at a war memorial. The hatred did not arrive overnight. It was constructed slowly, in total silence, across decades. And it started long before most people even knew his name. The wounds he never forgave. The Duke's coldness toward Camilla did not begin with Diana alone. It was built in layers, and one of those layers was far more personal. It had to do with his wife. The Duke's wife, Catherine, came into this world with her heart wide open, and this institution broke her for it. She loved too deeply. She felt too much. She grieved too honestly for a palace that expected its women to bury everything and keep smiling. She lost 2 babies in 2 years, a miscarriage in 1975, then a son, born still and silent at 9 months in 1977. She said afterward that she had no idea anything in this world could hollow a person out the way that loss did. The depression that followed swallowed her whole. In 1978, she was hospitalized for several weeks while the palace worked furiously to keep the story from reaching the public. There were long stretches where she disappeared from everything, no acknowledgement that she had ever existed. She walked away from the Church of England and converted to Catholicism, a decision that made her a silent target in circles that never forgave people for stepping outside the lines. This institution did not protect her. It ground her down and walked away. Inside Camilla's world, all of that was material for an evening's entertainment, and this is where it gets truly ugly. People who had worked inside those circles described gatherings where Catherine's suffering was dragged out and passed around like something to feast on. The breakdowns, the faith, the years of vanishing. And Camilla did not sit there quietly while others talked. She led it. She would work herself into such fits of laughter that she could barely stay in her seat, gasping, wiping her eyes. Like the image of Catherine's collapse was the funniest thing she had ever heard in her life. They called her unstable. They called her a humiliation. And the woman they were tearing apart had no idea any of it was happening. She was somewhere else, carrying wounds that had never healed, while her pain was being used as the night's best joke. When the Duke found out what had been said about his wife, something inside him died, and something else hardened in its place. Catherine had poured everything she had into a life that broke her. She had served without complaint through depression, through breakdown, that the public never fully understood. And the woman laughing loudest at her pain was the same woman who had burned another woman's marriage to the ground to get where she was standing. The distance between the Duke and Camilla stopped being a distance after that. It became a locked door, and he swallowed the key. And then he watched Camilla go to work on Catherine, because by the time that morning at the Cenotaph came, the battle between those two women over royal jewelry had already been running for years, and Camilla had been fighting it without a single moment of shame. When Queen Elizabeth died in September 2022, the jewelry that had defined her reign was quietly reviewed and distributed. Catherine had her heart set on a specific diamond brooch because of who had worn it before her. Diana had worn it twice, and for Catherine, that brooch was a thread connecting her to a woman she had spent years trying to honor in every way this palace would allow. She wanted to carry it forward. That was all she wanted. Nobody could have prepared her for what came next. The brooch went to Camilla. Catherine was told. She said nothing. She swallowed it whole and walked back out into the world like nothing had happened. But the people who were closest to her watched something collapse behind her eyes in the days that followed. She moved through that week like a woman carrying something so heavy it had changed the way she breathed. Those who saw her up close said her eyes told the whole story before her face could hide it. Red, swollen. That was how much pain losing that brooch to Diana cost her. The following year brought another blow. Catherine's team went through the proper channels and submitted a formal request for access to a Queen Mary tiara from the royal collection for a state banquet. The request came back denied. The same piece had already been directed toward Camilla for an engagement falling in the exact same week. People close to both households said the overlap was not accidental, that Camilla had seen the window and stepped into it deliberately, knowing exactly what she was doing and exactly what it would cost Catherine. What happened next made the whole situation even more shocking. It happened at a semi-private gathering, people she felt completely safe around, and what came out of Camilla's mouth that night set fire to everything. She said that Catherine's entire pattern of reaching for Diana's jewelry was a rehearsed act. Catherine was not honoring Diana. She was wearing Diana's memory like a mask stitched together from a dead woman's grief to make the public love her more. She said it with her face twisted in open contempt. She said Catherine was using a dead woman as a costume. The people sitting in that room said the ugliness that poured out of Camilla in that moment was so raw and so shocking that it changed the feeling of the entire evening. Several people shifted in their seats and said nothing because there was nothing safe left to say. The Duke heard every word of it. He watched Camilla treat the jewelry left behind by a dead queen like territory she was born entitled to claim. He watched Catherine absorb blow after blow and never once let it shatter her in public. And he recognized exactly what he was watching. He had seen this pattern before, the same hunger, the same targeting of a woman too dignified to fight back the way she deserved to. He had made his decision long before he ever stood at that cenotaph. The jewelry would go to Catherine, not Camilla. Camilla's response made it immediately and violently clear that she had no intention of letting it stand without a fight. She was going to confront Charles. The moment Charles went cold. Camilla did not go home that evening and fall apart. She sat down, gathered herself, and built a case. Carefully, methodically, the way she has always handled the things that threaten what she believes she is owed. By the time she walked into the room with Charles, she was not a woman who had just been humiliated at the most sacred ceremony in the royal calendar. She was a prosecutor, and she had prepared every word. She told Charles this was not about an old man's personal feelings. She told him this was bigger than that. The longest-serving duke in British history, a field marshal of the British Army, had stood at the cenotaph and publicly placed Catherine above the sitting queen consort. He had done it deliberately. That, she told Charles, was not a private gesture. That was an institutional statement, and if Charles let it stand without a word, he was telling every senior royal in this family that the queen consort's position meant nothing, that anyone with enough history behind them could undermine her whenever they chose and walk away without consequence. Charles listened. He always listens to Camilla. She has been finishing his sentences and shaping his decisions for longer than most people inside this palace care to admit. She has walked into rooms where his mind was already made up and walked out having changed it completely. There is almost no argument she has ever truly wanted to win that she has not won. Almost. This time, Charles did not move. And the reason why cuts straight to the heart of everything the Duke of Kent actually means to this king. The Duke of Kent is not a problem Charles can make disappear with a phone call. He is not a young royal who can be privately redirected. He is 90 years old. He has just buried his wife. His body is shutting down and everyone around him knows it. He belongs to a generation of Windsors that existed long before Charles began making the choices that nearly tore this monarchy apart. Before the affair, before the lies, before Diana was left to bleed in private while the palace looked the other way and called her the problem. The men of the Duke's generation did not put their desires above the crown. They did not put their comfort above their duty. They held the line completely without complaint, without recognition, and without ever once asking to be thanked for it. Charles did not always do that. The whole world watched him not do that. Charles knows that the Duke remembers. He knows that the Duke has always remembered. And that kind of memory in a man with nothing left to lose is a power that no title and no crown can ever reach. Charles looked Camilla dead in the eyes, and he told her the Duke was entitled to make his own private decisions. He said it once, and he was finished. Camilla left that room without a single word, and the people who know her well understand exactly what her silence means. When Camilla goes quiet after losing something, it is not because she has let it go. It is because she has already started planning what comes next. But here is what Camilla had never fully reckoned with when she built her case and walked it into that room. The Duke's jewels were never hers to touch in the first place, not by any law that governs this monarchy. The pieces the Duke holds are his private property. He can give them to whoever he chooses. He can sell them. He can leave them to whoever he decides in his will. No palace, no king, and no queen consort has any legal claim over a single stone. And besides, Camilla already has her own jewelry. She was crowned in May 2023, wearing a remodeled crown set with Cullinan diamonds. Her position was on paper. Her name was on the crown. Nobody was disputing any of that. But that was never what this was really about. And somewhere beneath all the fury and all the careful arguments she had built for Charles, Camilla knew it. A title on paper means nothing if the people standing closest to the throne refuse to bow their heads when you walk past. And that was exactly what was eating her alive. Not the jewels, the rejection, the fact that a 90-year-old man had looked at everything she had fought for and clawed her way toward, and had decided it still was not enough to earn his respect. But underneath all of this, something far more urgent was sitting in the room that nobody in the public conversation had yet fully faced. Something that made the Duke's decision not just meaningful, but necessary in a way that had nothing to do with old wounds or personal scores. If Catherine did not receive these jewels, they would not go to the crown. They would not find their way into the royal collection. They would pass to George, Earl of St. Andrews, the Duke's eldest son. George married a Catholic, which removed him from the line of succession. His wife holds no royal standing. Lord Nicholas, the Duke's younger son, converted to Catholicism and was removed from succession as well. Lady Helen Taylor lives entirely privately. Not one of the Duke's 3 children is a working royal. Not one of them moves in the spaces where royal jewelry is worn and witnessed and felt as something living. If the Cambridge sapphire fragments, the Kent pearl festoon tiara, the diamond girandole earrings, the pearl fringe tiara, and the remodeled diamond bandeau passed into George's hands, they would disappear into a private home. They would sit in a box in a room where no one connected to the monarchy would ever see them again. And the last remaining physical link to Princess Marina, a woman who carried Romanov history in her blood and had survived the collapse of empires, would vanish from the British crown as quietly and completely as if it had never existed at all. The Duke had been sitting with this reality for years, turning it over, looking at it from every angle, and he had arrived at an answer that was not built on sentiment. It was built on clarity, on the kind of decision that only a man who has watched everything and lost almost everything can make without flinching. The final decision. The Cambridge sapphires stretch back to Princess Augusta, Duchess of Cambridge, in the 19th century. From Augusta, they passed to Queen Mary after Augusta died in 1916. From Queen Mary, they passed to Marina as a wedding gift in 1934. That is more than 200 years of women lifting something precious and placing it carefully into the next set of waiting hands before they were gone. 200 years of making sure it survived. 200 years of refusing to let it be forgotten. Now sit with this for a moment. Cambridge was the first title that William and Catherine were given together when they married in 2011. The Duke of Kent is 90 years old and every corner of his mind is completely sharp. He knows exactly what the Cambridge name running through those sapphires means if they go to Catherine. It is a direct and unbroken line running from Princess Augusta through Queen Mary through Princess Marina, all the way to the woman who will one day kneel at Westminster Abbey and be crowned Queen of England. A line that has passed through more than 2 centuries of grief and survival, war and loss and endurance, and the Duke has chosen to be the man who keeps it from breaking. The pieces that survived the financial sales are extraordinary, and they have been invisible for far too long. The Kent pearl festoon tiara has not appeared publicly in decades. The diamond girandole earrings from Marina's personal collection have not been worn at a major state occasion in years. The pearl fringed tiara, the remodeled diamond bandeau, all of them sitting somewhere quiet and unseen, while the women who could carry them into history are frozen out by private succession rules that were never designed with the future of this monarchy in mind. Catherine would not let them sit. She has spent 14 years treating every piece of royal jewelry she wears as a living thing, with a story that deserves to be told out loud. When she wore the Cambridge Lover's Knot tiara at the state banquet for U.S. President Trump in September 2025, she was not just wearing a tiara, she was wearing Diana into that room. That tiara had sat locked in a vault for 18 years after Diana died. 18 years of silence and darkness. Diana had worn it to the state opening of Parliament. She had worn it in Hong Kong in 1989 in that famous white dress. She had loved it so much she wore it through the headaches it gave her. And every person who saw it on Catherine that September evening remembered Diana. Catherine was not wearing a tiara. She was bringing a ghost back into the room, and nobody in that space could look away. When she wore Queen Elizabeth's Bahrain pearl earrings at Commonwealth Day 2026, she was keeping Queen Elizabeth alive and present in a room that had already started moving on without her. Catherine was not trying to dazzle anyone. She was trying to make sure nobody forgot. And the public responded to it every single time because they could see with their own eyes that she meant every single bit of it. That is something that Camilla, for all her decades and all her titles and all her carefully placed crowns, has never once been able to produce in a single room she has ever walked into. The first time Catherine wears the Kent pearl festoon tiara in public, if that day comes, it will not simply be a beautiful woman wearing a beautiful jewel. It will be Marina's survival reaching across a century into the present. It will be the Romanov history carried in that bloodline walking into whatever event she wears it to and refusing to be erased. It will be proof that something precious was not lost, was not locked away in a private house in the English countryside where no one connected to this monarchy would ever lay eyes on it again. It will be proof that someone fought to keep it alive, and that someone was a 90-year-old man who had been waiting 30 years for the right moment to make his final move. In 2024, the Duke watched one more thing, and it sealed everything. Catherine's cancer diagnosis, the surgery. She took some time off. Then she came back slowly, on her own terms. She stood on the steps of Windsor. She appeared at Trooping the Color. She did not return to public life as someone performing a recovery for the cameras. She returned as someone who had walked through fire and come out the other side with more stillness, more purpose, and more quiet strength than she had carried before she went in. The Duke of Kent has kept his silence for 9 decades. He watched Diana destroy herself in private, while the palace circled her like wolves and called her unstable. He watched his own wife mocked and laughed at by people who had never genuinely suffered a single day in their entire lives. He watched Camilla reach into the jewelry left behind by a dead queen and take what she wanted, like someone collecting things they had always been owed. He watched Catherine absorb every single blow without ever once cracking open in public. He watched her survive cancer and come back, standing taller than before. And then he stood at the cenotaph, walked to Catherine, took her hand, and said out loud what 30 years of silence had been protecting. The jewels are going where they belong. He is writing the last page of his story now, and he has decided that after 90 years of watching and waiting and carrying it all in total silence, the final thing he will do before he is gone is make absolutely certain that when those jewels are next seen in public, they are exactly where Marina would have wanted them to be, around the neck of the future Queen of England.